Okay, we're going to investigate coil and plug ignition systems here. So we're taking a look at a Toyota Yaris engine, 4-cylinder engine, which has, as you can see there are 4 separate ignition coils. Each of the ignition coils is sitting directly on top of a sparking plug. The advantages of this system are it's very, very simple, very little to go wrong. We don't have to worry about HT leads, distributors, rotor arms, anything like that. So let's take a look at a coil and plug coil. So here we can see a typical coil. This is one from that engine, and you can see here this coil contains everything necessary to produce a high tension spark. In the head of the coil are the primary and the secondary windings, and going into the front of the coil are 4 wires. So we have to find out what those 4 connections are. Now, as you notice there, all 4 connections are low tension connections. Here we can also see the sparking plug, and this is where the sparking plug sits in relation to the coil. The coil sits directly on top of the sparking plug, hence the term coil on plug, sometimes abbreviated to COP. Okay, we got to look at a wiring diagram. In this case it's autodata, and here we can see the 4 ignition coils. Now we're going into coil number 2 simply because it's a little bit more accessible, and the engine coil number 1 is obscured by the dipstick. Okay, if you look at coil number 2, like the other coils, there are 4 separate connections. The first connection is from terminal 15, and we know that terminal 15 means live on the key. The second connection, connection number 4, just runs directly to ground. So this is the live and the ground supply to the coil. So if we want to measure the current consumption of the coil, we're going to have to get into one or other of the wires. There are also 2 more connections underneath, connections 3 and connections 2. So if you look at connection 3, you can see it runs down to the ECU, and if you look at connection 2, it's joined to all the other coils and also runs to the ECU. Now what this tells me is that wire number 3 is the wire that carries the unique signal that triggers coil number 2. So if we want to measure what's happening with coil number 2, we're going to have to get into that wire. Okay, so we're going to use an acupuncture probe to do that. So first of all, we're just going to take a look at the 4 wires. So there's the 4 wires there. So first of all, we want to get into the green wire there with an acupuncture probe. We'll just take a quick look at that there. And you can see the acupuncture probe is pointed. And the reason for that is it allows us to slide up along the side of the green wire. We're not going to damage the harness, and we're not going to damage any insulation. Now the other wire there, the black and red, we want to get a magnetic probe around that because we want to sense how much current the coil is consuming. Okay, that looks good. Let's go and see if it's showing on our oscilloscope. And there you can see it. Okay, so channel A is the blue channel, and you can see there that's measuring the current consumption of the coil. The little yellow diamond there, that's to indicate that I've set a trigger that whenever this line rises to that point, the oscilloscope will display this event. The red line in the background, well, that's the other wire. This is where the coil is being switched on and being switched off. So obviously, as soon as the coil is switched on, you can see the current start to rise, and as soon as the coil is switched off, you can see the current stops immediately. Okay, so now we know when the coil is being signalled on and being signalled off. The length of that red line there is actually the dwell time. In other words, the time that the coil is being charged. Older hands at this game would equate this to the time that the points are actually closed when the coil is being charged up. Right, so the next event that we want to look at there, and you can see we already have the green line, the 3rd channel there ready to go, is we want to see what's happening high tension wise with the coil. Now, because we don't have any direct access, we're going to use a particular type of probe. And what this does is it picks up the magnetic field from the top of the coil. Right, so we're just going to put it on top of the coil, and we may have to move it around somewhat. Okay, so let's go and see what we have here. And now we're getting all 3 traces. So this looks good. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually stop it. So I've hit the space bar in the computer and I've frozen the frame. So now let's look and see. We can switch off this engine. Let's look and see what's going on here. So going back to where we switch on the coil, we're going to get a small spark, and that will be reflected on the HT line. So that's known as a switch on spark. As the coil charges up, the coil will consume current, and then the instant that the coil is switched off, you'll notice that there is a peak in the voltage on the green line. So that point there is the actual firing voltage. Now once the coil fires, there is an ionized path established across the ground, and the spark will continue to jump. And the spark duration, or the burn time, is represented by this line here. So we can actually measure that. As the spark energy dissipates, we can see the final few oscillations here. So the spark stops, and then the last bit of energy is dissipated out. And we know now from other studies that we should have 4 or 5 little oscillations here, which we have, which would indicate a healthy coil. Now, if we want to go and measure the burn time, we can simply go to the corner and drag out our measuring bars. And we can find out exactly what our burn time is. So that's where the spark finishes. Go back and drag out another one. And that's where the spark starts. So if we look carefully, we might be able to see it here. And the actual burn time is 1.86 milliseconds. So there you have it. Coil unplug. We've monitored the switch on, switch off signal. We've monitored the current consumption, and we've monitored the HT spark.